Self-sovereign identity, that's a big mouthful, as we say, but what it really means is you own your identity and can take it where you want and use it how you want. And it's a right, but it's also a responsibility. We think it's a responsibility that everybody have an identity, that they can share pieces of that identity with others so that others can trust them enough to let them be permitted to do what they want to do. And again, the difference between a self-sovereign identity is, instead of it being given to you by a company or a government, you're able to have it in your own possession. You might have it on a phone, you might have it on a card, but again, you're not reliant, and it's not something that can be taken away from you by a government or a corporation. And a lot of people talk about self-sovereign identity with issues of privacy and security. Those are important issues. But the real point of self-sovereign identity is to be able to do trusted engagement with others. And so again, your self-sovereign identity is only as good as the people that are going to rely on it are able to trust it. And so that raises all sorts of questions about what goes into making a self-sovereign identity usable and practical and not just an academic exercise. And Global ID is really about bringing a usable form of self-sovereign identity to the marketplace and doing it for everyone, not just for an elite group of people, but the idea is that every identity everywhere in the world, every group, every person, even down the road, everything has its own identity that's provable and reliable to the party that needs to grant the permission for you to do the things you want to do. So let me pause there. It is based on blockchain. And so when you collect a credential, let's talk what a credential might be: that you've proven that you control a phone number, or that you have confirmed that your picture matches the picture on a government ID, or that you're able to log into a particular financial account. And the record of that gets written to a blockchain. There's particular identity favorable blockchains like Indy Hyperledger, and it's written in a particular format. There's a credentialing system and standard that's been developed by WC3. And so we write that to that standard. And so you don't need to have your identity written to that or read by that by any one application. Any application that adheres to that standard should be able to write to that and read credentials on that standard. And that standard is blockchain based. There's not a regulator. Right now, there's just these groups that are tied up again with WC3 that are developing these standards around DIDs, which are basically the addressing convention where you can find this. There's not-for-profit organizations or like Sovereign or Indicio that are developing these standards. And then there's companies like a Global ID that develop applications that just make it easy to use these standards. And so you can think of it as a ledger. There's protocols, then there's a couple of like not-for-profit organizations that are actually running the identity networks, and then there's application providers, typically for-profit companies, that are making specific applications, websites that make it easy for everyday people to use. Well, so you don't trust people because Global ID says you should trust them, because again, if it's self-sovereign, it means the person has collected their credentials. And so, for instance, if the person can prove that they trust, that they bank with BBVA, and that they've gone through a know your customer process with BBVA, and they have that credential, then what you're really asking is not, can you trust Global ID, but can you trust BBVA? Did they actually put that person through a proper screening process? And you can trust the blockchain to show that BBVA signed the transaction. And so Global ID is like an Easter egg basket, and the person goes out and collects their own Easter eggs. We just make sure that the Easter eggs are properly collected, but we're not the minter of the Easter eggs. The minters of the Easter eggs are folks like BBVA for a bank credential, or a particular hospital might be issuing a COVID credential. And so the signatures of those parties, they're the issuers of the credentials. That's ultimately who you have to trust, is who issued the credentials. Global ID is just an efficient way. You can think of it as like a browser for viewing those credentials, but we ourselves don't write the credentials. We just adhere to the standards and make it easy for people to collect those credentials and then show them to a relying party. When we talk about what we've been experiencing in society in the last 10 years, which are mostly the dominance of social networks, we know that those aren't very trusted, that there's a lot of fake identities, there's a lot of fake news, there's also a lot of abusive behavior and trolling. And clearly the levels of identity in those networks have created a trust deficiency. It's just not good enough to know that somebody on Facebook says they are who they say they are. It's too likely that that might be a fake or a scam. And so in this new world, we're looking for a combination of credentials, but still something that we get from the social networking world, which is engagement. So it's one thing to see that somebody has collected a lot of pretty and credentials that say they are who they are, but unless you're actually talking to that people, there's still some risk that they've simply gone out and created a synthetic identity and have one way or another gotten to be able to collect fake credentials. And so before you send somebody a lot of money, it probably would behoove you to be talking with them, to look at who else vouched for them, to really engage with them and see that they're engaged with the rest of a community before you really feel confident about them being the person who they say they are. And like, it's the same thing, whether it's sending money or voting or sending medical records. Simply having a list of credentials probably isn't enough to trust someone for a high risk activity. You want to actually have a history of engagement. And so a lot of times we're suggesting that before you really trust someone, you should have like a messaging history with them as well. There's an old computer program, it's called the Turing test. It's you ask a computer a certain number of questions, and how many questions do you have to ask the computer before you can tell whether you're dealing with a person on the other side or a computer? And still that test has never been solved. People are always able, after some period of time, to distinguish whether the person on the other side of the screen is a computer or a person. Well, that's the same problem here with trust. How many questions or what level of engagement do you have to have with a person before you're confident enough trusting them in some sort of activity where you're really putting yourself at risk? And so credentials are never enough. Looking at the person's vouches, the feeds that they've had, how long they've been a member and engaged with other people, that's really the combination of things that you need to have before doing something that's high risk in a situation where you don't have face-to-face contact. And so, again, we're looking to do that at a level that is more trusted than a social network. We call these instrumental networks, networks where the level of engagement you have with people is beyond social. It really is instrumental. And therefore, you're willing to do these higher risk activities in life that really are necessary for our society to function. It really is just sort of, think of it as any form of messaging or interaction that is beyond just social messaging. And so more trusted systems are like, there's a reason people shift to things like Signal and whatnot, but even on Signal, you need to know who you're talking to. Or even in something like Reddit, you may not know the true identity behind someone, but if you see that person has a lot of what are called karma points, those are upvotes from people in the community, you know that person has been around for a long time, and a lot of other people have put their trust in them as well. And so it's going beyond just mere text messaging and interacting with people in forms that create a belief on the part of the relying party that they're dealing with who they think they should be dealing with. And so a lot of the new networks that are coming up are things like Discord for gamers or Twitch or other environments where the people on those they're sort of like known entities. You may not know who they really are. It might still just be a pseudonym, but you know that person is the really good gamer, or the really, really competent blogger who knows a lot about politics of a particular situation. And that party has a long reputation, built up, many followers and many interactions. That may be the new form of trust capital, not just a check mark behind a box saying that some third party has verified this individual. That just means they've been very good at getting that check mark. And so we're really looking at the wisdom of the crowds. What level of interaction does this person have with many other people in many other situations that make you think that that is the authentic person who you believe you're talking to, and they really have the credentials and the reputation that appears to be there digitally. You need trust from other people to basically multiply your ability to trust quickly and efficiently. Well, we want it to be a big brain, but we don't want it to be a big brain kind of the way the Chinese do it, which is top down, which is Big Brother is the big brain and everybody else is like an ant. So we want to create, like you said, the big brain, the big network, but we want to do it bottom up. And so that's the real challenge is how to have that reach, that efficiency of like a WeChat kind of world, but not have it be like creepy like Facebook or kind of like Mad Max crazy like Telegram, where there's a lot of anonymous people that you really don't know who they are. So it's something that doesn't quite exist out there today, which is it has the reach of a Facebook or reach of a WeChat, but without that top-down dimension. We really need to develop this bottom up. So the consciousness is collective, it is self-sovereign, and yet it's still very efficient, very practical, can get real things done. So right now, the market of trust has been fairly broken because of the ways that we have, the way the social networks have evolved. And I feel partly guilty. Maya and I both come from Twitter, and Twitter, a lot of great things about it, but in many ways, it hasn't ended up building trust in the world. It's had a lot of situations where the network effects of Twitter have been abused for trust eroding situations where people end up finding out that they've been misled as to who is behind a particular Twitter identity, or there's trolls that behave very abusively. And so Twitter has not actually become a trust platform. It has many other attributes and benefits. And similarly, Facebook and other social networks have suffered from that. And the regulators themselves are having these hearings, but quite frankly, the regulators and the politicians, they might be very mad about the social networks, but they don't really know what to do. They don't know whether to curtail free speech, have more free speech. They're not really asking the question, I think, which is not a question about free speech or no free speech, is how do we make these platforms more trusted? Like, what do you need to do to make the reputations on these platforms trusted without necessarily outing people from a privacy point of view? And so does everybody have to use their real name for there to be trust? I don't think so. I think it should still be possible for people to have a handle, but you have to have a way behind that handle to know that if that handle is doing something that's illegal or abusive, there is a way to get back and find out the actor, the ultimate beneficial owner of that name that is doing the malicious behavior. And so we do still live in a world of law and not always order, but there has to be accountability, but that doesn't have to come at the expense of privacy. As long as people aren't crossing the line into a realm where they're abusing or actually engaged in criminal conduct, I think there is a lot of scope for people being able to operate with privacy. And so in this new world, people, whether using their real name or a pseudonym, need to be able to build up a trusted reputation. The great advantage of having a good reputation is it makes everything else life easier. It's like having oil in the engine. instead of having absolute proof of everything, which is a very technical approach, if you basically trust the party you're dealing with, you're going to give them a lot of leeway, and you don't have to have so many check boxes, so many checks to get things done and reach a transaction. Like, one of the key insights of Square when it started was that most transactions happen between two people who know each other, and yet many of the financial controls that are in place for payments processing are as if every party to a transaction are complete strangers that know nothing about themselves. And there are some situations where you're dealing with a complete stranger and you need a lot of help to feel trust in that situation. But many other situations aren't like that. And we need to recognize in society when the seeker and the provider, the sender and the receiver, any party to an interaction, whether it's for medical records, a vote, moving money, firing missiles, whether the parties know each other and trust each other already through some history and process that's already occurred. When that's the case, you don't need to have the same controls and friction as when you're dealing with relative strangers. And so the systems that we build need to use the fact that people can build up a reputation as an accelerant, as a friction reducer. And we don't have to build all our systems as if nobody knows anybody, nobody can trust anybody. And so you have to be able to get the best of both worlds. And so that's what we're looking to do, is to have people go out, collect credentials, interact with other people. And in some situations, it's going to be a real push to make sure that all those credentials have been checked, the vouchers, because two strangers are about to conduct a transaction and they really don't have any way to know that the other person isn't a dog on the internet, except to check all these credentials and try to evaluate the engagement that's happened, not with them, but with other people. But for most transactions, as long as we know we're doing this transaction, this engagement with someone we've already engaged with and have already decided we trust, unless there's been a hack that basically means that somebody else is hiding behind that trusted identity, as long as we know we're dealing with a person that we've dealt with before, we ought to be able to do things with much less friction. And everything we do should be a re-celebration of that trust, a deepening of that trust. And so the systems we build should reflect the fact that in most situations, we already trust the other party, and doing one more thing with them is just going to make us trust one another all the more. You don't have to put everything on the blockchain, but all the root of everything is on the blockchain. Like, for instance, if there's a video that somebody has done, or art that they've done, or whatever it is, that the underlying record of ownership needs to be on the blockchain, but the actual content itself can be on a form of a distributed database. There's new forms of distributed databases, not Dropbox, not Google, not Apple. The new forms come from companies like Filecoin, the interplanetary file system. So there's other forms of distributed database technology. They're not a blockchain, but they are distributed, that will complement the information that's on the blockchain. The blockchain you can just think of as a big title registry. We used to have a title registry for our homes, our cars, but now we can have a blockchain and a title registry for our credentials, for all the other content, virtual content that we've created or even received. It's just a record of who owns that asset. And I'm talking about assets here in a much more general way. They could be files, they could be credentials, it might be money. It could be any type of relationship between a person and something of value or something that needs to persist. But the actual thing of value doesn't have to be on the blockchain, but the title for it does. If it's not, it's very hard to then operate at a global scale. Everything would be trapped in silos, either by a company or a country, and then it wouldn't be portable, it wouldn't be interoperable. We would all live in these small little silos and we wouldn't know how to interact outside of that. That's the thing the blockchain allows, is it allows it to be portable and interoperable. That's the promise of blockchain. It's kind of a funny thing is to promote blockchain at a national level, because like the Indians have a system, Aadhaar, which is a fingerprinting and iris scan identity system. And I'm like, well, why don't you do it at a global level? And they go, well, it is just for Indians. And I'm like, well, if it's a thumbprint or a eye scan, how do you know it's an Indian? And they giggle. They go, ooh, you are right. We don't know whether we're signing up Pakistanis or Indians because they're just thumbprints and fingerprints. So blockchain is a technology that doesn't really want to know national boundaries. It might be promoted at a national level, but it's really hard for a blockchain to figure out like why it should stop at a national boundary. I would just say this is a really exciting time to live. That the meetings we've had in Spain on these topics, it really isn't a technology issue at the end of the day. We've talked about blockchain, but it really is a philosophical question, and I love that the conversations we have start at that high level of philosophy. And I encourage everyone not to get caught up in the technology, but to start with the philosophy of a possibility now to do things at a global scale, but are very, very personal and bottom up. And that's the really exciting thing, is that you can both have something that's self-sovereign, but that scales globally. And it's an exciting time. We haven't really had that opportunity in our lifetimes or in human history before. And so I welcome a chance for us to talk about that and for anyone to get involved who'd like to. Thank you.